Good day, participants. I'm Kai-ming Chen, Professor Emeritus at the University of Hong Kong. I have the honor of moderating the following 45-minute session with two speakers from different parts of the world. Chen, who's speaking from Malaysia, and Dankert Vedeler from Norway. Let me first introduce Kai. I've been reading regular newsletters from McKinsey, and very often they have articles on education that are milestone documents in education development. And here we have Kai, who's the guru behind those milestone documents. Kai has been with McKinsey as its senior partner, and he's based in Kuala Lumpur. He advises public and private sector organizations on large-scale transformation and strategic challenges. Kai also leads McKinsey's education practice globally. He has developed insights in the strategic thinking in education developments. So here's Kai.
Hi, everyone. Great. So thank you, Professor Cheng. So maybe I could start out with just to share a few thoughts and some highlights of some messages just to set the scene. Okay. As we talk about kind of systemic challenges and solutions in a pandemic, I thought maybe we could start out by sharing some lessons from global school system improvement and pandemic implications. Okay. Can I assume everyone can see the screen?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so why don't we dive in? And so the premise we wanted to start off by saying is, if you look at the last 20 years, global K-12 education spending has continued to rise. In fact, it's tripled over the last 20 years. Now, the challenge, of course, is with COVID, where do we go from here, right? But the message is, despite massive increases in spending, we are still failing children across the world. So this is before COVID. In a simpler time, we would say, despite massive increase in spending, 70 million primary school students have no access to school today. If you take into account secondary school age students, 340 million of them are out of school. And of those children lucky enough to attend school, 50% of them are failed by underperforming systems, and they don't meet minimum standards. If we look at this chart, right, so what this chart is showing is, if we look at school systems globally, school systems with have very different levels of spending, but they have very different outcomes. So this is an analysis we call the universal scale. So if you look at the horizontal axis, this is basically the cost per student, the amount that each system spends for each student, PPP adjusted in US dollars. The vertical axis is basically the outcomes. The vertical axis is basically outcomes in terms of a universal scale mapped to PISA. So as you can see, for each of these performance bands, countries perform at very, very different levels. And there's a wide spread. So for example, you see countries who are spending more than 13,000 US dollars per student on one end of the scale. At the other end of the scale, you see countries spending less than 1,000 US dollars. And as you can see, it's not necessarily how much systems spend, but what they actually spend on. And by the way, each of these performance bands is equivalent of one school year difference. So for example, if you look at, let's say, the United States, which spends about 10,000 US dollars per student, compared to, let's say, Vietnam, for example, who spends between 1,000 to 2,000 US dollars per student. That is the same performance band, but 8 to 10 times the difference in spending. Okay, so if I go to the next chart. So the question then is, what is it about the world's best performing school systems that allow them to perform so differently? And what is it about the best systems in the world in international assessments that allow them to do so well? And over the last 15, 20 years, when we look at the past, one fact comes across, which is, at the end of the day, the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. And the only way to improve outcomes is to improve instruction. In fact, for the best performing school systems, high performance requires every child to succeed, not just certain cohorts, certain schools. Right? But then, if the next question is, how do the world's fastest performing systems keep getting better? How do the world's most improved systems keep getting better? How does the system get from poor to fair to good to great to excellent? And then we started looking at what is it about these systems that allow them to accelerate? And there's a few lessons, but maybe the most important one is the following, right? Which is there is a unique intervention cluster that exists across each of the performance bands. So for each system that has gone from poor to fair to good to great to excellent, the interventions are universal. So when we looked at the last 15, 20 years, 70% of education reform efforts globally failed. Systems either fail to ignite reform or they fail to sustain the results. And a big part of the reason is they were using interventions not suited to their starting point of the improvement journey. So as you think about it, when systems go from a poor performance to fair performance, they tend to focus on the same things that allow them to accelerate. Whereas when the system gets to good to great, for example, they need to focus on different things. And these are fairly universal. So what you see on the screen now is the concept of clusters of interventions. So you can see for a system that is at the poor to fair performance journey, the focus is around achieving the basics of literacy and numeracy. So here the focus is around how do we help underskilled, undermotivated teachers achieve motivation, getting better scaffolding for low-skilled teachers, getting consistency, getting the basics right in terms of literacy, numeracy, getting kids into schools, getting school infrastructure up to minimum standards, expanding school seats. Here, the focus again is on consistency. How do we provide prescriptive teaching materials? How do we provide more support by schools? And this is not about taking agency away from teachers. This is about providing teachers with more support, not less. At the other end of the scale, when a system is at the great to excellent phase, here the focus is around improving through peers and innovation. So for example, this is around how does a system cultivate peer-led learning? How does it get collaborative practices going? How do systems use collaborative practice as the engine of growth, for example? How do we create system-sponsored innovation? How do I identify innovations in terms of schools at the district level, for example? Which school, which district, which is delivering outcome beyond what it should do? And how do I identify it, replicate it, disseminate it, and scale it up? And of course, at the fair to good part of the journey, this is about getting the foundations in place, getting pedagogical foundations right, data, financial, organizational foundation. And then at the good to great phase, good to great improvement journey, this is about shaping the profession. This is about raising the caliber of teachers and principals. This is around the concept of earned autonomy, if you will, school-based autonomy. So as schools improve, they get better, they become more independent, they gain more autonomy, and they require less support from the center. So so this is, as you can imagine, this is the research from the last 15 years. Of course, then we have a pandemic. So the two concepts that we'd like to think about as we go forward is, on the one hand, there's something about recommitting. There's recommitting to getting the basics right, recommitting to what we know works or doesn't work in school system reform. And then the other side is, how do we leverage the pandemic to reimagine? So as I think Minister Nadiem earlier has talked about, COVID is an opportunity. It's created a great impetus for behavior change, for parental engagement, unlike anything that's seen. However, inertia is a very powerful force in education. If once the next 18 months, the next 2 years go over, how do we prevent us reverting back to normal? How do we seize the moment? So as we consider moving forward, there's the recommitting part. There's also reimagining part. How do we not just recommit to what works, but how do we shape the future? So some thought starters for us. Look, we know more than we did in the spring in terms of public health risks, in terms of childcare, in terms of what is the impact on student learning and thriving from COVID, and we know how to safeguard schools. There's some things we still don't know. But perhaps there is a few things we can do to start rethinking certain fundamental elements of education systems. So for example, harnessing technology at scale access. Maybe this isn't about substitution, technology substituting teachers, but how do we integrate to enhance access quality? Maybe this is not about one device for every child, but low-cost solutions, device plus software to support group learning. Is there something about thinking around moving towards mastery-based learning? So enhancing formative assessments, smart adaptive technology, integrating instruction, practice, feedback, self-paced learning to move closer towards the goal of personalized learning. Is this something about using this opportunity to rethink how we support children holistically? We've seen that mindsets matter. Mindsets matter a lot. As systems, can we start thinking about mindset interventions on persistence, motivation, behavior, independence? How do we help students adapt the future of work, for example? So as COVID accelerates transformation of many other sectors and industries, can we accelerate the focus not just on the basics, but the languages of the future, digital literacy, coding, analytics, for example? Is there something around investing in new models of teacher preparation and development? If we have unprecedented shift towards digital. Can we take advantage of this, leverage technology to reimagine professional development in service training? Can we think about simulations? Can we think about more tools and devices to provide scaffolding, for example? How do we think about unbundling the role of the teacher? So for example, teachers as a learning navigator to help students adapt to remote learning. Could we think about unbundling teachers in terms of differentiated roles, different pathways, specialist roles, teaching roles, administrative roles? Could we think about using COVID as an opportunity to reallocate resources equitably, more support for schools that need help the most? Maybe incentives for top schools to support low-performing schools, or incentive for top schools to catalyze remote learning. Should we also think about rethinking school structures and policy, maybe even changing the school calendar? We know, for example, that the long summer break is perhaps not ideal for learning. There's learning loss. This is a function, for example, of the agricultural system. Now that COVID has exacerbated the learning loss, our systems are thinking around how do we restructure around the concept of a long summer break. Do we revisit policies on early sorting in terms of pathways or tracks, rethinking remedial and repetition? I guess the message here would be inertia is a strong force in education. How do we make sure that this isn't just about a flash in the pan? How do we make sure that we use the next 18 months, we use the disruption that COVID has caused us to look ahead, to not just recommit, but also reimagine, reshaping into what students really need? Thank you. Professor Cheng?
Thank you very much. Before we go to Dankert, I would like to pause for a few minutes for a poll. The question here is, which of the following have provided the most support to families to help their children continue to learn from home? A, government. B, school. C, peer parents. D, friends. E, NGO. F, others. We'll spend the next few seconds to receive the poll results. While we are working on it, I think Li Kai's presentation has left us with a lot of food to think, food for thoughts. The pandemic is a disruption. In the negative sense, the disruption has caused a suspension of classes and the closure of schools. But in another sense, this disruption means we almost experience an experiment of how students could learn outside classrooms at home. And so this is what we are facing. We are talking about new normal, and I noticed that McKinsey's documents are talking about next normal, because there's always a new normal after another new normal. So is the result out? I suppose this is the result. We have 114 responses at this moment. Yes, this is more or less what we have. So the largest percentage, 49.7, is the school, right? And then the second largest is peer parents, The third, which is now go down to 18%, is private business. NGOs, I'm sorry, NGOs. Yeah. Okay, now let us turn to Dankert. Dankert Vedeler is my peer colleague in the advisory committee of the Yidan Prize. He's a senior policymaker in Norway, and he's responsible for quite a number of very successful reforms in education in Norway. But he's also better known in the international arena for his contribution to UNESCO and other worldwide movements. In particular, his prominent contribution to the Chen Declaration, which was formulated in 2015, and which underpins the EFA, the Education for All movement, the new movement that started 2015, and it is for Education 2030. This is a very fundamental document, and Dankert is instrumental in that formulation. Dankert, up to you.
Thank you very much, Kai-ming, for these kind words. Dear friends, I will start by congratulating Yidan Foundation for organizing this timely event. I'm honored to participate in the conference far from my own country, Norway. This is the beauty of living in a virtual world. No pollution, interesting conversations. And I think I build on what Kai was saying about COVID-19 and reimagining education. We have one global pandemic, but it hits different and adaptation will vary across countries, between education systems, among education institutions, and for individuals, students, and families. We have to acknowledge this. No script, neither for challenge nor solutions, but we may identify generic issues that can be of common interest if adapted to the specific context, an inspiration for strategizing rather than a guide. I have 4 main messages, and I speak in capital letters due to limited time. Though bad, we should treat the crisis as a window of opportunities for needed educational reforms. Second, we need to address inequities with priority and smartness. 3, keep track. We need continuous data and information for policy making. And 4, invest in the future, safeguard education budgets. Message 1, a window of opportunity. What will be, as Kai-ming said, the new normalcy? We all know the situation. 1.6 billion children kept out of school. And the immediate response, blended education, internet, radio, TV, and face-to-face in small groups. It has made the best out of whatever you have. Contingency plans rarely existed before the crisis. And circumstances force changes in education delivery. An archaic system based on tradition from the past 200 years has been challenged. But there have been positive responses. Teachers have risen to the challenge, changed their teaching methods and behavior, learned by the lessons, and been very committed. Parents' involvement has increased. Students have acted more responsible for their own learning, better disciplined, have less stress, and their attendance have increased. It seems like the social media has become a useful educational tool, seminars on Snapchats, better hygiene, fewer sick leaves, social distancing. But there is a painful lessons learned, I think, for most governments, and a painful lesson for many politicians. National closure of all education institutions may have been a too high price to pay. But we have 2 major challenges to address, I think. 1, returning to education after COVID-19 What kind of normalcy are we looking for? How can we change? And the second, what about social-emotional skills, or what's been called 21st century skills, which I think was elegantly described by the education minister from Indonesia. Collaboration and empathy are difficult to learn through the internet. The second message, fighting inequalities. Sustainable Development Goals Agenda clearly states, no goals are met if not by all. This is more relevant than ever. If no remedial action, education losses will be great. A South African study shows that without catch-up strategies, same level of learning outcomes will not be reached before 2028. And with remedial strategies, we may be back on track in 2024. Poverty will take its toll. Children, mostly girls, will drop out of education. At the moment, 368 million children with no access to school meals, which has devastating consequences for malnutrition and even hunger. And we see that the Bourdieu's cultural capital theory kicks in. Children from less educated families will lose out. Children doing their studies from home won't have the parental support needed. And we have to have a system response, strong priorities with targeted interventions, all seen through a vulnerability lens. The third message, urgent need for better, broader and more timely data for continuous policy making at all levels. Education data production has so far been adapted to the traditional speed of education development, means not very rapid. Administrative data has taken a year to produce at the best. COVID-19 challenges this, both the dependency on administrative data as well as timely production. Policymakers need real-time data for their decision-making. In a pandemic, a situation of uncertainty, they have to act quickly. I have three examples. The German presidency of the European Union have this week presented a survey done among its member states to see their response to the pandemic, covering all educational levels. They've been surveying three main areas: the general implication of COVID-19, thematic challenges, and lessons learned and the way forward. I think this draws inspiration for all members of the Union. The second example is from Statistics Canada. Has been able to gain rapid insight into the impacts of COVID-19 on Canadians using crowdsourcing, a new non-probabilistic data collection method that gathers timely information. One such crowdsourcing exercise focused on the impact of COVID-19 on post-secondary students. Over 100,000 post-secondary students participated in the online crowdsourcing data collection about how the pandemic was impacting their academic, labor market, and financial situation. While crowdsourcing surveys are not representative of population of interest, they do provide key insights in a timely manner. And the third example is from my own country. Statistics Norway estimated economic cost of delayed student progression in higher education and lost learning in kindergartens through upper secondary school. The value of lost lifetime income due to reduced human capital and reduced parental labor supply is estimated to 1.7 billion each day as long as the school remain closed. And 1.7 billion is just the same as Hong Kong dollars about. Never has education been valued this high. Data delivery is challenged, need timely data and a broader spectrum of data based on innovative methods for timely policy making. We need to know more now. The fourth message, investing in our future, safeguarding educational budgets. National education is hit by decrease in GDPs. UNESCO estimates at least $210 billion will be cut from education budgets next year, simply owing to decline of GDP. Pressure to reallocate scarce resources to health and social safety nets might cut 5% from education budgets, amounting to a total loss of $337 billion in education spending. Parents' reduced income and ability to finance their kids' education will decrease. This hit low-income countries hardest. A larger proportion of family earnings provides for their kids' education. Global aid to education is challenged. Prioritization between aid budgets and domestic needs in developed countries. When GDP taxes are reduced, aid budgets need to be protected and redirected towards countries facing the biggest challenges. We have at least one positive signal from Germany that they intend to double their aid to education. And there are clouds in the horizon. There is a looming debt crisis that could starve education at a time when billions of young people living in poverty face the prospect of permanent unemployment. We need to make the case for education, but by cooperation between sectors instead of competition. Health, education, employment. COVID-19 has made linkages and interdependence more visible than ever. Education advocates need to join hands with health advocates and other public sector supporters. Central to building back better must be a recognition that existing education systems are inequitable, excluding girls and children with disabilities and disadvantaging the poorest or more excluded communities. As the Global Education Monitoring Report 2020 notes, the promise of reaching the furthest behind first is not being kept. The gravity of the crisis could be our chance to get things right. The global education community will be summoned by UNESCO on the 23rd of October to address this situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Again, you have laid out not only the description of what is happening, but also the issues we have to tackle at this point. And indeed, from both presentations, we understand that we are indeed facing a new normal, which is very much accelerated by the pandemic. One country told me that they planned to train teachers for 5 years in order to adapt to online learning, but it happened in 2 weeks. So this is happening in most systems. Now let us come to questions. I've got several questions, but one question is, has the traditional method of face-to-face learning changed forever? Will most learning be online from now on? Could I have responses from the two panelists? Yes or no?
Kai-ming, may I come in?
Yes, please.
Yes. No, I don't think. I think at best it will be a blended learning with technology and face-to-face learning. I agree with all those who said that you can never replace a teacher. It will still continue to play the important role in all children's education. But I think the way teachers are teaching needs to be revised. John Hattie, in his meta-studies, has surveyed saying that 89% of time in lessons are done the teachers are speaking, and 90% is about facts. I think this needs to change. This is not efficient teaching. So I think there will be a change in the way teachers are teaching, and technology and may help and support, but never replace.
Thank you.
Yeah, I echo that as well. I think the sense is technology in education, use of technology in education, I think is inevitable. The acceleration is inevitable, but I think at the current speed and course, technology will never substitute, replace a teacher. But what we are seeing some schools and some school systems doing is, how do they reshape the role of the teacher with technology, whether this is unbundling different roles, freeing up teacher resources for teaching and learning as opposed to administration, better supporting teachers. We're using technology to differentiate teacher roles in a classroom, for example, in schools.
Yes, we've done some discussions here in Hong Kong, and I arrived at the observation that at least the new normal will have three components. One is traditional learning, and where teachers will play an important role because according to the science of learning, learning is really a social condition. It's people to people. However, as Dankert said, if the teaching is more or less about delivery of information, transmission of information, then it can easily be replaced by robots, by AI. And so the learning, the real experience in this pandemic, school closed down, is that students, we are given an opportunity to experiment how students are learning, can learn beyond schools and outside campuses, outside classrooms. But nonetheless, what Dankert mentioned about social and emotional learning is also essential, particularly in this new era in society. And teachers in Hong Kong begin to miss the kind of the school life, campus life that is taken for granted all the time. So three parts: traditional learning, online learning or self-directed learning, and then campus life, which is a kind of an implicit learning. What do you think about that? Or maybe I try another question. Now this is a question about how do you tackle this disconnect in how we compensate our educators versus how much their work impacts society. That is, teachers' work have become very different. And this is about, now maybe I should expand that question to what will be the new role of teachers? Could you expand on that?
Yeah. Perhaps I can touch on the point about
yes, you made that point. Yes.
Teachers and compensation. I think when we look at global school system reforms over the last several decades, I think one fact is very prominent, which is the quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. So what the world's best education systems do is they prioritize teachers, quality of teachers, teacher welfare above all else. So some of the best systems in the world are willing to compromise on class sizing. So larger class sizes, but less number of teachers, so they can raise the bar on teacher quality and teaching quality. That also allows them, for example, to optimize for a budget to actually pay teachers more. But what we're also seeing these systems do is they, in order to, for example, enhance the profile of teachers to make teaching the profession of choice as opposed to the profession of last resort, that the entry-level pay for teachers is quite important. So in many of these systems, you will see that the entry level of pay for teachers is equivalent to some other professions, right? Whether this is engineers, accountants, doctors, and so on. Now, when you look at the overall career trajectory, that's the increase in the salary may not be commensurate as other professions, but the entry point, starting point is important. Now, as we start thinking about the role of the teacher going forward, one of the more interesting lenses some system taking is in a world of increasing hybrid learning, if it's not full remote learning, perhaps the role of the teacher also needs to adapt to that of a learning navigator to help students navigate remote learning, hybrid learning, to access resources, given the complexity of doing it.
That's a good term, huh? Teachers as learning navigators. And sometimes people say teachers will become learning designers rather than just instructors. Dankert?
Yes, I think for the last point, I think that I hope that we could use the situation with kind of thorough research on how students have adapted and the best way they have learned during the crisis, put in a situation, a kind of experimental situation that will never occur in history before, I think, and it's a global experimentation. So here I think there's a lot of research results that can be found. Regarding the teacher and the status of teacher, which I think has been emphasized again and again, and it is important. It's probably the most important. But I think the evidence here is very contextual, because I think one of the high-performing countries which has been caused a quite envy among the Nordic countries, it's Finland, that is not using most on education, but it's definitely achieving most according to PISA, the learning outcomes. Here, there is a selection process of teachers that all the other Nordic countries are just looking amazed at, because they pick 1 out of 5 applicants to become teachers, while in Norway you almost have to look for students that want to become teachers. So there is a huge gap, or there's a huge difference in the selection process. But that has not so much to do with the salaries, and that's the kind of surprising part. The teachers in Finland is not necessarily paid much better than teachers in Norway or Sweden or Denmark. So there is still some questions to be solved in this regard.
Yes, I appreciate very much when Li Kai, in one of his slides, that with the same spending, systems perform very differently. It means that there are other elements rather than funding that will affect the performance of your system. On the one hand, you may say, you're spending so much, why are you not doing so well? But on the other hand, you may also say, you're not spending so well, doesn't matter, you can still do well, right? So it's a very interesting, because many countries will say, I'm doing all my best because I'm spending so much. This is perhaps not a very sound argument. Li Kai, would you add to your slide?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Professor Chen, which is, it's admittedly, systems do have to spend in order to improve student outcomes, improve teaching and learning. But as we've seen from the analysis, you do have to spend a certain level before you can get to a certain level of performance, but that may be a function of GDP. But what is more apparent is it's not how much you spend, it's what you spend on. For example, are you spending, for example, on professional development features?
Yes.
Are you spending disproportionately on raising the quality of teaching classroom instruction? Or are you spending perhaps on less direct factors on teaching and learning? Yeah. But also, what interventions are you spending on? For example, are we spending primarily on improving access? Are we also investing in improving equity? Because coming back to the pandemic as well, one of the things which I think Dankert and Ms. Nadim also talked about is the risk of exacerbating equity gaps, the risk of widening performance achievement gaps. So the research on the 2005 Pakistan earthquake is quite telling, for example, where with just 14 weeks of school closures, although after the school closures, enrollment came back up, no loss in enrollment, but the learning loss was significant. So 4 years later, children in the affected districts by the earthquake were on average 1 to 5 to 2 years behind their peers in other districts. So closing the gap is important. The reason we say equity gaps are exacerbated is kids in those affected areas where mothers, I think, or parents have primary level education, the gap was closed. So the concept of small time in school closures, 14 weeks, causing 1 to 5 to 2 years of learning gap, and even greater gaps because parents were less educated.
That's right. That's right.
So our school systems investing not just on the right things, but investing also in terms of things around closing the rural gap, closing the remote schools gap.
Yeah, I think the pandemic has almost amplified all the issues in education. Inequity is one of them. Many countries, even very developed countries, face this digital divide because some students are in home environments where there's no Wi-Fi, so you can't start any online learning at all. And also, yesterday I was discussing with a number of principals. They said with online learning, you see the students' gaps are enlarging. And I think that is natural because you are facing a totally different mode of learning. You can't measure it with the old mode of learning. And therefore, we have to prepare for a new normal. we used to think education is equitable if you can put students into schools with a place, with classrooms, with chairs and tables and desks and with textbooks. But now it's not sufficient, perhaps, and that is a new challenge. It's a new challenge. What are the basic equipment requirements, expectations for a school, for students? Is well beyond classrooms. And some countries are doing very positively about this online learning or school-based learning. One example I can quote is Mongolia. Mongolia is going to start its new semester almost right now, and they have decided with very little pandemic infection to have 2 days at home and 3 days in classrooms. That's a new challenge. That's a new normal, perhaps. But unfortunately, we have to come to a time, although there are also many other questions. But thank you very much for this contribution from afar. And thank you for Yidan Prize for giving us this opportunity to interact with so many participants. Thank you very much.